Welcome back to the Green Lectionary Podcast, a production of Creation Justice Ministries. The Green Lectionary is a conversation on Scripture through the lens of creation justice. My name is Derek Weston, and today we will be looking at a text for the third week of Advent. My guests today are Reverend Karen Mann, pastor of Sojourners United Church of Christ in Charlottesville, Virginia, and Jerusha Neal, assistant professor of Homiletics at Duke Divinity School, and author of the recently released Holy Ground, Climate Change Preaching, and the Apocalypse of Place. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to encourage you to support the work of Creation Justice Ministries. The recent election has been a moment that has created a sober awareness of what lies ahead of us. Yet in the midst of that awareness has come a sense of clarity. We are made for this moment. Each year, thousands of churches use our resources to spark dialogue about creation justice. We inspire hundreds of clergy to bring creation justice to the pulpit, and we amplify congregational voices to advocate for systemic change. We are fostering a culture of creation justice, a thriving counterculture in congregations across the nation. Please consider making a special year-end gift to help Creation Justice Ministries meet this moment. You can give online by going to creationjustice.org/donate. Thank you for being our partners in building communities of resilience and resistance. Join us now as we look at Luke 3 through the lens of creation justice. All right. Our text for this week is Luke chapter 3, verses 7 to 18. John said to the crowds coming out to be baptized by him, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the coming wrath? Therefore, bear fruits worthy of repentance, and do not begin to say to yourselves, 'We have Abraham as our ancestor.' For I tell you, God is able from these stones to raise up children to Abraham. Even now the axe is lying at the root of the trees. Therefore, every tree that does not bear good fruit will be cut down and thrown into the fire." And the crowds asked him, "What then should we do?" In reply, he said to them, "Whoever has 2 coats must share with anyone who has none, and whoever has food must do likewise." Even tax collectors came to be baptized, and they asked him, "Teacher, what should we do?" He said to them, "Collect no more than the amount prescribed for you." Soldiers also asked him, "And we, what should we do?" He said to them, "Do not extort money from anyone by threats or false accusation, and be satisfied with your wages." As the people were filled with expectation, and all were questioning in their hearts concerning John whether he might be the Messiah, John answered all of them by saying, "I baptize you with water, but one who is more powerful than I is coming. I am not worthy to untie the strap of his sandals. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and fire. His winnowing fork is in his hand to clear his threshing floor and to gather the wheat into his granary. But the chaff he will burn with unquenchable fire." So with many other exhortations, he proclaimed the good news to the people. So, where is creation in this passage?
A better question is, where is the good news in this?
Right. That's right. That's right. I mean, it's almost like a ching, like it's, you almost don't know if there's like a tongue-in-cheek sarcasm at the end. And with all these other exhortations, he proclaimed the good news. Oh, but that's deep, right? That's deep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I love that this also shows up on top of it ending that way, naming all this as good news. It's showing up on this sort of Joy Sunday for many churches, right? You light the joy candle and it's Brood of Vipers Day. I mean, this is great stuff. You couldn't write this stuff. Like that's marvelous. I'll start with one thing, and then Karen, I know you've got plenty to add. I know. I just want to talk about wilderness. So one of the things that's compelling that we don't read in this frame of this scripture is it starts, like Luke does at several points, by naming all of these really important people in history. It does this right before Jesus's birth too. But right at the start of chapter 3, it does this. And then it says, "But the word of God came to John in the wilderness." And there's this decentering of all of this imperial power and putting us in this place that is both very sparse and difficult, and also this sort of place of salvation, which like the wilderness has always had this dual sense in the biblical narrative. It is both this challenging, sort of scouring kind of place. And it's also this place you go to meet God. So actually this tensiveness in the good news in all of this, repent stuff, that really fits with the ground we find ourselves in this text.
Yeah, and he's still in the text we're reading, still there in the wilderness, right? So the crowds and the tax collectors and the soldiers are all coming to him out in the wilderness. He's not speaking to them in their context. They're coming out to the wilderness there. I hadn't thought about this beforehand, but while you were just talking about wilderness, I'm remembering at the beginning of Lent this last year, I preached about Jesus in the wilderness, as one does on the first Sunday of Lent, and talked about desert instead, and just how the desert is, or in this case, wilderness, is deceptive. Like, we think of the desert as a place of scarcity, and that there's actually a surprising amount of abundance that happens in desert or wilderness. And I actually think that goes really well with this passage, because I think there's a place in here where you can talk about how the message in here is that there is actually abundant resources available. And what John is exhorting the people to do is to share those resources, to not cheat, to not extort, not exploit, but to share. Don't hoard what we've got here. There's enough to go around if we shared it, which I think is an essential message in the midst of the climate crisis.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I'll go off of that too. I mean, I think as somebody who teaches preaching, this passage is interesting to me because it pays more attention to John's sermons than any of the other gospels, right? And I mean, almost like the baptism's almost an afterthought, right? It's really the sermons that Luke wants us to pay attention to. And this question about, okay, so good news for who and joy for who is really foundational to his preaching. The contextualness of it, like the way in which he says, now, the soldier said, well, how about us? And then these other, the crowd said, well, what do we do? And the tax cut, what do we do? And there's this sense of the particularity of this moment, that this good news is crafted for the particularity of response required. There's this kind of honesty there. To your point, Karen, I also think it might be a really lovely meditation on how preaching changes when we're standing on sort of displaced ground, wilderness ground, on desert ground. Like, what do we see that we didn't see before? And what I hear you saying, Karen, is one of the things we see is there's plenty. It's just, it's not shared. And perhaps we also see that the good news requires sacrifices of some for the enough and well-being of all, right? Like, there's things you see in the desert you don't see other places.
Yeah, and he's giving specific instructions to each different crowd. So it's not, in some ways I want to say, like, the things he says, this is like just the bare minimum of being decent human beings, like, or don't cheat, don't extort. Bare minimum, let's treat each other kindly, right? But also it's particular. I mean, he's looking at the crowd, and presumably those are the common people, right? And he's just telling them, if you've got an extra, share it. And he's not even telling them to give the one thing they have away, but if you've got an extra coat, share it. So it's sharing out of abundance, which, again, back to that, the desert seems scarce, but if we really look, we might see that we have abundance. And to the tax collectors, it's the don't cheat people out of their money. Just take what you're supposed to take. Do your job. Don't do more than that. And of course, to the soldiers, don't abuse the people. Again, bare minimum here, but specific to the people that are receiving the message. I think if I were going to be preaching this passage, I would probably then look at my context and say, okay, then what should we do? and speak specifically to us. What should this group sitting in front of me do?
Mm. I'm I'm really struck by um I'm struck by the natural images that John does use. First off, he sees the crowd and calls them vipers. So that's real fun. Um, and then the next like creation image is that of a tree that's not bearing good fruit and that's about to get chopped down.
Yeah.
And then the kind of concluding like creation image is on a threshing floor where there is chaff that is going to be burned. And a lot of the creation images that are I think so often when we look at texts, when we have these conversations, the text of creation is life-giving, creation is um abundance and flourishing. But to the original point of like, where is the good news? The creation images here are like
Dangerous.
they're dangerous. They're things that are on the precipice. They're things that are on the verge of destruction. And it's real complicating because it's almost, well, not almost, it's God standing in the space of destroying those natural things, the tree with that's not bearing good fruit, and the winnowing fork, and the burning chaff.
Yeah, I would say, Derek, that also the question posed right at the beginning, who warned you to flee from the coming wrath,
Yeah.
is bringing creation into it because of how often uh, natural disaster or floods or all that stuff has been framed as being God's wrath. I would
Mm,
throw a lot of caution around that because of
absolutely.
the way wildfires have devastated communities, especially when you get to the divine fire at the end of the passage, or hurricanes, especially with the flooding right now in Appalachia. To really be nuanced about that,
Hmm.
because I don't think we want to set up natural disasters as divine judgment upon people,
Yep.
because it's often been those who are impacted are the poor and the marginalized
Yeah.
disproportionately. And that instead, this is really just revealing the devastating impacts of humanity on these, both the systems of injustices that make it so that racial communities, racial minorities, and marginalized communities are impacted the worst, and the human impact on climate change itself. Um, I feel like that has to be done in a nuanced way, but certainly I was drawn immediately to that, who warned you to flee from the coming wrath, because if it feels like it's saying none of us can flee from this, right? And if we think
Mm,
about the climate crisis, that's the truth. None of us can flee from this. So then what do we do? Um, yeah.
mm,
So it strikes me that like there are these three moves he makes. I mean, very concretely. Again, I'm just looking at it as someone who's looking at his sermon, right? Like there's a repentance move,
hmm,
then there is a restore community move,
hmm,
and then there is this move about like this re-encounter with this spirit that's bigger than you. I mean that
mm,
there's this sort of, I mean, in his words, it'd be more like a messianic move, right? But
hmm,
there's this spirit, this reference in Luke to this spirit, um, uh, and I want to linger on that threshing floor for a minute because I do think it's significant when you take the metaphor seriously. The aim of threshing is to save the wheat, not to burn the chaff. Like that's the
right.
whole point of it, is not to have a big conflagration of chaff. There's no, the point is to save the kernel,
Hmm,
which I think is, that's significant.
hmm,
But it also means that like um I was reminded as I was thinking of that word threshing And I mean, this has come back in a lot of folks' conversations, because it's this very beloved conversation that Krista Tippett had with John O'Donohue some years ago, Irish poet. So I've seen this pop up on blogs, but I remembered it when I read it this week, this passage. At one point in this conversation, this poet says, about this word threshing. He said that the root of the word threshing is the word threshold, that there is in the threshings of our lives the chance for a door to open to a place we haven't gone before. And also to go through the threshold into the new, there's often a threshing required. And I think that is closest to what I feel like the last move of the sermon is. It's trying to give people enough courage to imagine going through a threshold into an encounter with the holy that will require some threshing, but that is worth it. And so to me, it feels less like about disasters and actual fires than like a genuine sort of, there is a kind of, yes, purification that is needed, but that where we're headed is actually good news. And what then would that mean for the way we live together?
I love that. And there's something, there's something to this that, like, in some ways this particular sermon could only be good news for a brood of vipers. Like, it could only be good news if at the other side of this you were no longer a brood of vipers. That threshold, I really love that. I love that as an image.
There's a little like
Derek,
a Greek tidbit that's very short. That word brood is a rare Greek word. And it comes from, it's related to the word for fruit. So actually this theme of fruit in the first section is really strong. It's like, you're the fruit of vipers, and yet you're a tree that doesn't bear fruit. And what would it mean to bear fruit? What do we actually mean?
Oh, wow.
Fruit that could be eaten and sustain a community. What would good fruit even look like? Okay, I'm sorry, Karen, I interrupted you.
No, that's got me thinking about something else. I think what I was going to say is that it's good news to those who have been hurt by the vipers. If the brood of vipers is cut down, right? So I think you were saying something about the vipers being redeemed, and certainly I hold possibility for that. But it's just good news to the people who have been living under oppressive conditions.
Yeah.
For the vipers to be cut away.
Yeah. It's both. I think it's both and. It's because if the tax collectors, tax collectors and soldiers in this context, I'm putting them in fruit of vipers column. But absolutely, for the people who have been on the underside of their actions, it's good news for them to be cut away. Yeah, a lot of good stuff there. So where's the call for us to, how are we being called to interact with creation through this passage?
Not very long ago, I think it was in September, the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, she's been working on the issue of debt reduction for countries that are on the front lines of climate disaster, debt forgiveness, actually, with the World Bank for a long time, for many years. There's an extended article on this a couple years back from the New York Times Magazine if you want a deep dive. But just as of September, she's addressing the General Assembly at United Nations, and there's this initiative called the Bridgetown Initiative, sort of first released in 2022, where it's really taking seriously that the way that the sort of World Bank has oriented itself in relation to struggling nations that are having these hurricanes hit its shore is, on the one hand, they say, well, you know, you have all of this debt. You need to put in austerity measures. But of course, the austerity measures are precisely the things that mean they can't respond when a hurricane comes and destroys the nation. And so on the one hand, you never get ahead on the debt, and yet you also are always stuck in austerity measures. And she's just named this. She said, actually, you know, we might be able to get out of debt as a country if we weren't facing increasingly year after year after year, fiercer storms and fiercer storms and fiercer storms from the choices, economic choices that countries around the world are making, for which we are not responsible. And yet the costs are unseen. And so because that cost is unseen, we are bearing both the impact of that cost as well as somehow being held accountable for debt, and then say we can't even respond meaningfully to countries in crisis. I mean, to me, this is one of those examples, Karen, you named about sharing, right? Like if you're in an environment where people need a coat and you know, where taxes are owed, right? What would it mean to be fair? What would it mean to actually like say, oh, actually, there are all kinds of ways in which you've been dealing with our economic choices for a very long time and absorbing the brunt of that. And yeah, I mean, minimally, I think we're even. I don't think you owe us anything anymore. I mean, that's the argument she's making at the United Nations. That's just one sort of contemporary example that came to mind.
Yeah. I know this will not air until December, but I can't be anywhere except today, which is the day before the election. And for me, climate change is always on the ballot. And I hear in these words a reminder that we always need to be thinking about, the way I engage with creation is to remember that I am part of creation. I don't get to flee this coming wrath, right? Whatever's coming, I am part of it. And so I need to be thinking about, how do I vote in ways and for policies and politicians and that who are going to keep these efforts at the forefront to help to heal our climate in whatever way that we can. That's a huge part of my faith, is to be involved in those political things, right? And you know, feeling a lot of fear and uncertainty, but I do hear hope in this passage, because I do think things will be hard, but I do have hope that what will be left is the goodness of God's creation in the end, that the wheat kernels will be there once the chaff is gone. Not that that won't be a hard process. It feels hopeful, maybe not comforting in the moment, but it does feel hopeful. The other thing I was going to say about that is, you know, knowing that this will air in December, I mean, the Christmas season, I know this is Advent, but the secular Christmas season has become so much about consumer and consumption driven, and we're hearing a corrective to that in this. Just let's share, like Jerusha was saying, a reminder that we need to share, both on an individual level and on a more global, national level.
I'll add another thing is, you know, you bring up the election. And of course, when our listeners listen to this, they will know more than we know on this day before the election, perhaps.
Maybe.
We hope.
Let's hope. But one of the ways I think you could preach this passage in a season where we're talking about a lot of doctrines and beautiful kind of the incarnation and like all of this, there can be a pushback on climate preaching about it being quote unquote political. What I think is really interesting is, I mean, this is a deeply doctrinal moment in the gospel, Jesus's baptism. There's after the part we read, there's just 2 verses. It's verse 21 and 22. You're my beloved son in whom I'm well pleased. I mean, this is like big moment in Luke, and it's completely, I mean, it in some ways it's overshadowed by this extended conversation about economics, extended conversation about politics. To say, look, to really get what baptism is about, to really get who Jesus is about. And we see this, of course, in Luke 4, the chapter after this, in Jesus's first sermon, right? To really talk about what baptism means. This baptism isn't the end of the story, it's the beginning of the story. And it's this call to live as a new community together. I'm reminded of, in the Methodist Church, you have these baptismal vows that you say that talk about renouncing the wicked powers of the world, and rejecting the evil powers of the world, and sort of renouncing the spiritual forces of wickedness. There it is, right? And there's a way in which all that can kind of get fuzzy. Oh yeah, I'm against the spiritual forces of wickedness.
Sure.
And then here you have John being like, all right, so what's the coat you're giving away? And what is the debt that you're forgiving and writing off and not asking payment for, right? What is the sort of military might that you are renouncing in order to have a more just balance of power in the world? How is that working? I mean, it's quite concrete in the way it presses us past doctrine into practicalities.
Yeah, I love that the whole thing it's harsh on first reading, but it's also and it feels really urgent. But yeah, it's so concrete, and it's in some ways easy. Share. That he's not giving them hard directives here, or at least they shouldn't be hard directives.
And yet, Karen, look what happens. I mean, I think this is the other thing about what happens when you preach from the wilderness, or you let the wilderness inform your preaching, or however you want to say it. He ends up in prison.
Sure.
So right after the end of this sermon, like that very basic message, very basic, don't extort people, don't blackmail people. Herod throws him in jail, and he ends up and so I also think, I guess I would want preachers to know both that their sermons matter more than they think they do in this fight. I mean, Luke thinks this matters a lot, this sermon. And also sermons are more dangerous than you think they are. Not just to you. I mean, Herod wouldn't have done that if he hadn't felt threatened. Like, this sermon was dangerous all the way up to the top.
Yeah. Well, and just think about the preachers these days who just read that text and get accused of being too political,
Right.
It's, yeah, I'm with you. It can be given, depending on your context, probably more dangerous in other contexts than it would be if I preached that sermon in my context, but yeah.
It's funny that, kind of our first response to this text is, oof, this is harsh. And yeah, like, it's harsh because I have 2 coats. It's hard because I have food in my freezer, and John is saying something that, to your point, Jerusha, is incredibly practical and tangible and actionable. That which I think is yes, it's very easy to renounce the forces of evil. It's very easy to renounce the forces that are causing our climate to change. But then what are the practical, actionable things that I'm doing in my life that are going to make the world more livable for the person who doesn't have a coat and the person who doesn't have food on their table. Um, and it draws this out of the, like, let's over spiritualize this question and put it into real concrete, do something about the world that you live in, do something for the world that you live in, or maybe stop doing some things that you have been doing, that, to your point, Karen, are affecting those who are under the foot of empire. It affects the way that where our social location is. And I think, again, our tendency, our very Western tendency of, like, reading ourselves as the hero of texts and not necessarily reading ourselves as the people in empire who might be being called out, um, is something that, our own social location speaks into this text as much as anything.
Yeah, that takes me to a part that we hadn't talked about,
Mm.
which is when verse 8, where he says, "Therefore bear fruits worthy of repentance, and do not begin to say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our ancestor. For I tell you, God is able from these stones to raise up children to Abraham." And that one strikes me as just what you were saying. Like, don't assume that because of your identity, whatever that identity might be, that you are safe from what's coming, or that you're not responsible for what's coming.
Yeah.
And I think we could tease out, what is the identity that we hold for ourselves that makes us think we would be safe from this? Either we have enough money to avoid the worst of the consequences of climate change, or we live away from where most natural disasters happen, or whatever it is that makes us think we wouldn't be, included in that.
Yeah.
Or that we don't bear some responsibility. I think
Yeah.
anybody could look at this and say, well, I share, and I'm not a tax collector, and I'm not a soldier, but there are ways in which we also bear responsibility.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, right before this sermon, there's that gorgeous quote from Isaiah. But every mountain shall be made low, every valley shall be filled and lifted up, rough places made smooth, and all flesh will see the salvation of God.
Mm.
And again, it's not all humans, it's all flesh. It's that word that you started this whole conversation with, where is creation in this story? And in some ways, this is the sermon that John preaches for what will have to happen for all flesh to see God's salvation. And we sing that passage at Christmas. It sounds awful lot like the Magnificat, which we're going to hear at Christmas. I mean, it sounds it's all over, but it does mean that those that have too much are brought down, so that those that do not have enough are lifted. And I mean, this is just, that's, and yet this final word of joy, because that is joyful. What is it we finally want at Advent? For all flesh to see salvation, for all of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. How much do I want that today? Yeah. A lot.
I might also read Zephaniah with this when we do it. We only usually read one reading here, but this might be a time where I had two, because especially in verses 18 and 19 of Zephaniah 3, it says, "I will remove disaster from you," and then a little bit later, "I will deal with your oppressors at that time." And I think that just highlights also what John is saying there, that ultimately God is going to remove the chaff from this and just leave the wheat, which is what is the nourishing part of the plant that leads to life.
Yeah.
So I will say this, I do think this means, this does speak then to the contextuality of interpreting this passage for your people, like as a preacher, in the same way that John has particular words for particular groups, right? That there is this question of, where are my people on the mountain or my people in the valley? And what is it that John is doing in the social context into which I'm preaching? I think of this because Karen and I have been both a part of this climate justice preaching cohort over the last couple of months. And another member of the cohort does climate justice preaching outside the US and inside the US. And one of her big questions has been, how do I preach in such a way that actually brings restoration and comfort and hope to folks on the front lines of climate disaster, often outside our national boundaries, though not always. And at the same time, preach in such a way to really hold accountable folks in positions of power. And interestingly, I think a passage like this can do both, but you have to be able to, make those kind of moves that John makes there.
Yeah. 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 That's a tightrope walk. Because in many of our congregations, we have both.
That's right.
We have both.
That's right.
And that is a tightrope walk, to be able to speak the thing that the people need to hear.
But it's not as hard as we think. I mean, it's not a particularly fancy rhetorical solution that John comes up with here, or that Luke comes up with describing John's sermon. He said, look, if this is you today, like, this is the question I have for you, but maybe this is you right over here. And this is also I think, I don't think we have to be stymied. I'll get preachers in my classes who are so stymied by the fact that there's like multiplicity and diversity in their congregation, or that, even more than multiple sort of groups in the congregation. It's true that there are, on any given issue, oppressors can turn into those that oppress, right? That happens. And so they'll almost say, well, I don't even want to we're just going to step back from anything dealing with power or politics or economics or anything. And I just think, John just gives us this beautiful, concrete example of what would it mean to take a principle, like this beautiful principle in Isaiah of valleys lifted up, mountains brought low, and to look at this diverse group of folks and say, yeah, here's what that might mean if you're a soldier. Here's what that might mean if you're a tax collector. Here's what that might mean if you've got more than one coat. What does it look like for you? That's big.
Yeah, you could just make that a refrain in the sermon. Just here's this group. What then should we do? And
what then should we do?
What then should we do? Yeah.
What then should we do? Beautiful.
Yeah. Well, and that's such a great segue into the last question of where's there a call to action for the church in this text? I think we were getting there. I think we're basically there. But where is there a call to action for the church in this text?
I think it's partially a call to examine where you are. What is your location in this? And that maybe is the job of the preacher, but I think also the preacher inviting individuals to consider where they find themselves in this text, and which of those concrete things John, Jesus, Luke, whoever is calling them to in this place, both as individuals and as a congregation.
When I look at the three moves of this sermon, right, I look at the first is about what we add, right? The first is about fruit. What do you add to actually bear fruit? The second is about what you lay down, whether it be power or luxuries you don't need, right? And the third is about encounter. It's about a threshold, going into a new reality with a God that's bigger than you know, which is right where we are at Advent, on the very edge of a new world. And there will be a cost to go there, and yet, again, to have salvation for all flesh. What joy.
Hmm.
What joy.
What advice or help would you give to pastors who might want to preach this text through a creation justice lens this Advent?
Yeah, I think it's right there waiting for you. I don't know. I think you got it. I think you said it. Derek, is why we're quiet. I think we're like, yeah, John kind of said it.
It's really right there. It's right there.
It's an easy one, but I mean, it's an easy in the terms of finding creation justice or climate justice, whatever, in the text. I don't think that's hard to do. It's the fact that it appears during a sacred cow of a season, right? That people want to have. I mean, that's not what Advent's supposed to be, but joyful. I guess it is the Sunday of joy, so I don't know.
Yeah.
You know, this falls on the third Sunday of Advent. That's always our pageant, so we're never going to read this text, right? That's always our Christmas pageant on the third Sunday of Advent. And so I think the struggle is not where can you find climate justice to preach from this text, but do you have the courage to do that during this season, I think is the question.
Yeah, congregations will give you that first week when we sing hymns in the minor key and okay. And then, but then by week 3, you should be on the upswing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think this is one you could preach out of season for sure.
Yeah. It's so important. There's a reason that it's put smack dab in the middle of Advent, almost near the end. I mean, because it is about incarnation, right? It is about how do you take these immense spiritual themes and in any way give them material weight in the world. It requires this kind of granularity. I think it is. I mean, I'm actually kind of glad it shows up on the Joy Sunday because I think it requires a reframing joy. It just I would go right into the storm. This is crazy. How is this joy? And then actually paint the world that might be possible if people lived this way. So that at the end of the sermon, people are like, that's what joy is. That's actually, I want that.
Well, and you could also take a joy as an act of resistance stance to this and pull in some stuff from Barbara Holmes, who passed recently. But when I've been thinking about the coming Sunday, the Sunday after the election, I'm like, how do I know what to preach on that Sunday? I'm sort of up in arms. And I decided, you know what, we're doing joy. We're doing joy because joy is always there, and joy, even if the worst happens, joy is an act of resistance. And I think you see that in this passage that that no matter the coming wrath, right, there is still joy. And we can still be joyful together in the midst of whatever comes through the ways that we share and care for one another. And that's what we're being called to in this passage, and that is joyful.
That's true. Beautifully said. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a good place to end. Karen, Jerusha, thank you so much for this. This is such a rich conversation, and I echo the need, the opportunity that's kind of right here in front of us that this text gives us, and the importance of preaching this during Advent, the courage to preach this during Advent. So I want to thank you both for giving people some insight and some wisdom of how they can approach this text as it does appear on Joy Sunday. So hopefully people will be able to help others find the joy in it. So thank you both for your insight and your beautiful thoughts on this.
Yeah, thank you. And Karen, thank you as well.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for the Green Lectionary Podcast. This episode was produced by Sprocket Wagner, and the music was provided by Christian McIver. Please like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and help us spread the word with a good review. Leave us a comment to let us know how you've used the show and how we can make it more useful for your ministry. You can learn more about this and other programs of Creation Justice Ministries at creationjustice.org.
Our story comes alive within these pages, for every time and place throughout the ages. God speaks and is heard, and the enduring word calls us to care for our world as we share the love that can set creation free. Restoring the earth to wholeness, peace, and harmony. Let the songs of the water, land, and sky resound, 'cause together we're all bound. Within these pages, there's always new life to be found.